Come inside before this weather kills you. An old man said those 7 words to a dying stranger wrapped in Hell's Angels leather, and 3 days later, 800 motorcycles shut down an entire Cleveland street just to find him. Most people would have locked the door and pretended they heard nothing. Leonard Hayes opened it. He had no idea that one small act of mercy given in a freezing alley at 2 in the morning would bring the most feared men in America straight to his doorstep. Not for revenge, for something nobody, not even Leonard, ever saw coming. If you believe one good man can still change everything, subscribe and stay with me to the very end of this story, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see just how far Leonard's story has traveled tonight. Leonard Hayes had cleaned the floors of Ashbury Towers for 30 years, and in all that time, only one person had ever asked him his name. That person was about to die in the alley behind the building. It started with a sound, just a sound. Leonard was emptying the 3rd floor trash chute a little after 1 in the morning when he heard it under the howl of the storm, a wet, broken cough that didn't belong to the wind. He stopped. He held his breath. 30 years of working nights had taught him the difference between the building settling and a human being in trouble. This was a human being. "Hello," he called into the stairwell. Nothing answered him but the rain hammering the windows. He almost let it go. A man his age, 74 years old, with a bad knee and a worse back, had every reason in the world to finish his rounds, lock up and crawl onto the cot in his basement room where it was warm. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody would have ever even known. But the cough came again, and this time it had a word stitched into it. "Help." Leonard set down his trash bag and went to find his coat. The alley behind Ashbury Towers was the kind of place people hurried past. Lake Erie threw its November fury right down the throat of it, funneling wind and rain between the brick walls until the cold felt personal. Leonard pushed the heavy service door open against the gale, one hand shielding his eyes, and at first he saw nothing but black water running off the dumpsters. Then the lightning came, and in that one white flash he saw him. A mountain of a man slumped against the wall with his legs splayed out in a puddle that was rising past his boots, soaked black leather, a vest covered in patches Leonard couldn't read in the dark, but could feel in his stomach the kind of patches that told you to walk the other way. The man's head hung forward, his chest rose and fell in short rattling jerks. Every instinct Leonard had screamed at him to step back inside. "Hey," Leonard said instead. "Hey now, can you hear me?" The man lifted his head, maybe an inch. His eyes were glassy, half shut, fever bright. "Bike," he rasped. "Broke down 3 blocks. Couldn't make it." "How long you been out here?" "Don't know." The man coughed so hard his whole body folded. "Couple hours, maybe more." A couple hours. In that cold. In that rain. Leonard had buried men who'd survived worse and men who'd died from less. And he knew, looking at this stranger, that the line between the two was getting thinner by the minute. He crouched down slowly, his knee popping like a gunshot, and pressed the back of his hand against the man's forehead. He nearly pulled it back. The skin was burning. "You've got a fever, could cook an egg," Leonard muttered. "We need to get you inside." The man's eyes focused on him for the first time, really focused. He took in the faded gray uniform, the lined face, the thin shoulders, the broom-handle wrists. And then this enormous, dangerous-looking stranger did something that broke Leonard's heart a little. He laughed, a weak, bitter, exhausted laugh. "Old man," he whispered, "you can't lift me. Go back inside. I'm not your problem." That's so. Nobody comes out here for guys like me." The man's head dropped again. "Go on. Pretend you didn't see." Leonard stayed exactly where he was. "Son," he said, and his voice was quiet, but it had something underneath it, something the storm couldn't push around. "I've been pretending I didn't see things for 30 years. I'm too old to start again tonight." He stood up. He looked at the door, then back at the man, then up at the black sky pouring down on both of them. And he made the decision that would change his life, though he didn't know it yet, the decision that 3 days later would bring an entire army to a Cleveland sidewalk. "You're not going to make it standing," Leonard said. "So we're going to do this on our terms. You put one arm over my shoulders, I do the rest. And if you fall on me and break my hip, then we both lie out here and freeze, and at least we'll have company. Deal?" The man stared at him. "Why?" he said. It wasn't even a question anymore. It was disbelief. "Why would you do this?" "Because you needed help," Leonard said simply, "and I was here. Now give me your arm before I change my mind and let the rain finish the argument. It took everything Leonard had. He would not remember much of the next 10 minutes clearly, only the weight of the man, the burning heat coming off him, the way they staggered through the service door. Like two drunks in a three-legged race, the way Leonard's knee screamed every single step. Twice they almost went down. Twice Leonard hauled them both back up by sheer stubbornness, growling, not yet, come on, work with me." They reached the basement stairs, and Leonard realized there was no way down them upright. "Sit," he ordered. "We do it on our backsides, one step at a time, no shame in it." So that's how the most feared kind of man in America came into Leonard Hayes' home, scooting down a basement staircase on his backside in the dark with a 74-year-old janitor's hand fisted in his collar, both of them swearing under their breath. The basement maintenance room was barely a room at all. A folding cot, a radiator that hummed and clanked, a coffee maker older than some of the tenants upstairs. Paint peeling off the walls in long curls, but it was warm, and right then warm was the most valuable thing in the world. Leonard peeled the soaked leather off the stranger's shoulders. The man was too weak to do much more than grunt. Underneath the wet clothes, his skin was gray and shaking. Leonard wrapped him in every blanket he owned, 3 of them, the good wool one his late wife had knitted, the scratchy gray one from the donation bin, and the thin one he usually only used in summer, and still the man shook. "You got a name?" Leonard asked, setting water on to boil. A long pause. "Marcus," the man finally said. "Marcus Kane." "Marcus," Leonard tested it. "All right, Marcus, I'm Leonard. You're going to drink something hot whether you like it or not, and then you're going to sleep, and in the morning, we'll figure out the rest. That's the plan. Any objections?" "You should call somebody," Marcus said. His eyes had drifted half shut again. "A hospital. You don't know who I am." "I know exactly who you are," Leonard said. That got Marcus's eyes open. "You're a man freezing to death in my alley," Leonard went on, stirring instant soup into a mug. "That's the only part that matters to me at 2 in the morning. The rest of it, whatever's on those patches, whatever you've done, whoever's looking for you or running from you, that's a daytime problem. And it ain't daytime." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. Then so quietly, Leonard almost missed it under the radiator's clank. "Most people are scared of me." "Most people are scared of everything," Leonard said. "I'm too old and too tired to be scared of a man who can't sit up straight. Drink this." He pressed the warm mug into Marcus's enormous trembling hands and steadied it until he was sure the man wouldn't drop it. And Marcus Kane, road captain, the kind of man who'd made grown men step off sidewalks, drank cheap instant soup from a chipped mug, and tried very hard not to let the old janitor see his eyes go wet. He failed. "It's the fever," Marcus muttered, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "Sure it is," Leonard said gently and looked away to give the man his dignity. "Sure it is." The fever broke and surged through the night like a tide. Around 3, Marcus got worse. He started shaking so hard the cot rattled against the wall, talking to people who weren't there, calling out names. "Danny, Danny, slow down the curve, watch thee," and then going silent in a way that frightened Leonard more than the shouting. Leonard sat on a folding chair beside the cot with a wet cloth and didn't move. He pressed cool water to the big man's forehead and his neck. He talked. He talked about nothing, about everything, about 30 years of mopping floors, about the boiler that broke every February, without fail, about how the night shift was the only honest work left in the world, because nobody bothered you and nobody pretended to be anything they weren't. "You hang on now," he said around 4 a.m. when Marcus had gone quiet and still. "You hear me? I didn't drag 200 pounds of leather down my stairs to watch you quit on me. That'd be downright rude." Marcus's eyes cracked open. "Rude," he repeated, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Damn right. Now breathe. Slow." By 5, the worst had passed. The shaking eased. Marcus's breathing settled into something deeper, something that sounded less like a man drowning. Leonard finally let himself lean back in the folding chair, and only then did he realize his own hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the long hours of holding another person on the edge. He looked at this stranger sleeping in his only bed, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He felt useful. Marcus woke a little before dawn, clear-eyed for the first time. He lay still, studying the cracked ceiling, then turned his head and found Leonard dozing upright in the chair, the wet cloth still in one hand. For a while, he just watched the old man sleep. When Leonard finally stirred, Marcus spoke softly. You sat up all night. I sit up every night, Leonard said, rubbing his eyes. It's my job. You just gave me better company than the trash chute. Marcus didn't laugh this time. He pushed himself up on one elbow, slow and careful, and looked at Leonard with an intensity that would have made most men flinch. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to tell me the truth. Go on. When you found me out there, Marcus's jaw worked. You saw the patches. You knew what they meant. Don't tell me you didn't because I watched your face. He leaned forward. So I need to understand. Why help a man like me? What were you after? It was the question of a man who had learned the hard way that nobody does anything for free. The question of a man who'd been hated so long he'd stopped expecting anything else. Leonard heard all of that in it. He set the cloth down on the table. He folded his old hands in his lap. And he answered without a single second of hesitation, the way you answer something you have always known. Because you needed help, Leonard said. And I was there. That's the whole thing, son. That's all of it. There's no second half to that sentence. Marcus stared at him. That's not how the world works, he said quietly. That's exactly how the world works, Leonard replied. Folks just stopped doing it is all. Doesn't mean it stopped being true. Something moved across Marcus Kane's hard face. Something that took the man 30 years in a brush with death to reach. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his huge scarred hands. My little brother, he said finally, and his voice came out rough. Danny, he went off a wet curve outside Sandusky 11 years ago. November. Storm just like last night. He swallowed. He laid there in the rain for 2 hours, and 40 cars drove past him. 40, the report said so. 40 people saw a man down in the road and decided he wasn't their problem. The radiator clanked into the silence. By the time anybody stopped, Marcus said it was too late. Leonard didn't say anything. He understood somehow that the right thing here was to let the man finish. So when I went down in that alley last night, Marcus said, lifting his eyes to Leonard's, and they were burning again, but not with fever now. I figured that was it. That was how it ends for guys like us. Alone in the rain while people walk past. I'd already made my peace with it. His voice cracked clean in half. And then some old man I never met in my life comes out into a storm and gets down on a bad knee and tells me I'm not his problem to walk away from. When he had to stop, he pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes. You have no idea what you did, he whispered. You have no idea what you just did. I made you some soup, Leonard said softly, and I'll make you breakfast in a minute if you can keep it down. Marcus laughed, a real one this time, wet and shaking and amazed. Yeah, he said. Yeah, old man. I think I can keep it down. They sat together as the gray light started creeping down the basement stairs. Two men who could not have been more different, drinking burnt coffee from chipped mugs, while the building groaned awake above them. Leonard told Marcus about his wife, gone 4 years now. Marcus told Leonard about the road, about the brotherhood, about the family he'd found after he lost the one he was born to. They talked the way men talk when one of them has just watched the other almost die without armor, without performance, without anything held back. And right before Marcus drifted back to sleep, full and warm, and safe for the first time in longer than he could remember, he said something Leonard didn't fully understand at the time. You treated me like family, Marcus murmured, eyes already closing. Nobody treats us like family, not from the outside. A pause. We don't forget that. We never forget that. Get some rest, Leonard said. You'll see, Marcus whispered. You're gonna see. Leonard figured it was the fever talking. He pulled the wool blanket up over the big man's shoulders, the way he used to do for his daughter Emily when she was small, and the nights got cold. Emily, who he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, not since the funeral, not since the words they'd both said and couldn't take back. He pushed that thought down where he kept it. Then he climbed the basement stairs to start his morning rounds, his knee aching, his back aching, his eyes heavy with a sleepless night. He had no way of knowing that downstairs before he fully woke that afternoon, Marcus Kane would borrow Leonard's old landline phone. He had no way of knowing what one phone call from a Hells Angels road captain, a call that started with 3 words, I found him, and he saved my life, and we owe him, could set into motion across 4 states. He had no way of knowing that in 72 hours, the quiet street outside Ashbury Towers, the street nobody ever noticed, the street he'd swept 10,000 times, would not be quiet at all. For now, Leonard Hayes simply pushed his mop down the empty hallway in the gray dawn An invisible old man doing an invisible job, humming a song his wife used to love. 3 floors below him, a stranger he'd saved was already dialing. Marcus Kane held Leonard's old landline, phone to his ear, with a hand that still trembled, and when the line connected, he didn't waste a word. "It's Kane," he said. "I'm alive, and I need the family." On the other end, a gruff voice he'd known for 20 years went sharp. "Marcus, we've been calling you for 2 days, brother. Tank rode past your last known and found your bike dead on the side of Woodward, with no you anywhere near it. We thought," the voice broke off, "we thought the worst." "I almost was the worst," Marcus said quietly. He looked toward the basement stairs, listening to the faint shuffle of Leonard's mop on the floor above. "I went down in a storm, fever, couldn't walk, laid in an alley behind some apartment building, and Reese, I'm telling you." His throat closed. He had to stop and breathe. It was Danny all over again. "I was lying in the rain and I'd already given up." A long silence on the line. Reese had been at Danny's funeral. Reese knew exactly what that meant. "What happened?" Reese said. "An old man came out." "An old man?" "Janitor, 70-something, skinny as a rail, bad knee. The wind could have knocked him flat." Marcus's voice was thick now. "He got down on the ground next to me, Reese. Saw the patches. Knew exactly what they meant, and he hauled me up anyway. Dragged 200 pounds of me down a flight of stairs on his own back. Sat up all night with a wet rag and wouldn't let me quit. Made me soup." He laughed and it cracked. "Cheap soup, out of a packet. Best thing I ever ate in my life." "Marcus, you don't understand." I asked him why. I asked him what he wanted out of it. Marcus pressed his eyes shut. And he looked at me like I was crazy for asking, and he said, "Because you needed help, and I was there." That's it. That was the whole answer. No angle, no fear. 40 cars drove past my brother, and this old man walked into a storm for a stranger in Hell's Angels colors. When Reese spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. "What's his name?" "Leonard. Leonard Hayes." "And where are you?" Marcus told him. The silence that followed was different this time. It was the silence of a man already moving, already reaching for his keys. "Sit tight, brother," Reese said. "Get your strength back. Eat the man's soup." A pause. "And don't tell him a thing. We're going to handle this the right way." The line went dead before Marcus could ask what the right way meant. He set the phone down slowly. Above him, the mop kept its patient rhythm, back and forth, the sound of a man who had no idea what he had just set in motion. Marcus lay back on the cot, stared at the cracked ceiling, and for the first time in 11 years, he didn't feel the cold weight of Danny pressing on his chest. He felt something else. He felt like the universe had finally evened a score he thought could never be evened. Upstairs, Leonard finished the second-floor hallway and leaned on his mop to rest his knee. Mrs. Petrakis from 2C opened her door, took one look at him, and frowned the way she always did. "You look terrible, Leonard." "Long night, Mrs. Petrakis." "You're too old to be working nights." She said it the way she said everything, like a complaint, though they'd both learned over the years that it was her way of caring. "One of these mornings, I'm going to find you collapsed in this hallway. Then you'll have the cleanest hallway in Cleveland to find me in," Leonard said, and she snorted despite herself and shut her door. He didn't tell her about the man in his basement. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't a thing you announced. By his own quiet code, you helped a person, and then you kept your mouth shut about it, because the second you started telling people, the helping turned into bragging, and bragging spoiled the whole thing. So Leonard kept Marcus a secret. He brought down eggs and toast that afternoon and watched the big man eat like he hadn't eaten in a week. He found an old pair of his late wife's brother's coveralls in a storage closet, far too small but dry, and laughed with Marcus about how ridiculous they looked stretched across his shoulders. He checked the fever every few hours with the back of his hand, the way you check a child. And slowly, hour by hour, he watched a man he'd been told his whole life to fear become something closer to a friend. "Your bike," Leonard said on the second evening, sitting in the folding chair. "You said it broke down 3 blocks over." "Carburetor probably, or the fuel pump." Marcus shrugged. "Some of my guys will come get it eventually." "You got people coming for you then?" Something flickered across Marcus's face there and gone. "Yeah," he said carefully. "I got people." "Good." Leonard nodded, satisfied. "Man shouldn't be alone in this world." "I know a little something about that." Marcus studied him. "You said you got a daughter." The words landed heavier than Marcus could have known. Leonard's hands went still in his lap. Emily, he said. Yeah. She close by, couple hours, Akron. Leonard looked at the wall at the long curls of peeling paint. Haven't talked to her in 3 years. Marcus didn't push. He just waited the way Leonard had waited for him that first morning. Her mother passed, Leonard said finally. 4 years back, cancer. It was a hard way to go and a hard time. And Emily and I, we didn't grieve it the same. She wanted to talk about everything. I wanted to talk about nothing. We had words at the funeral, bad ones. His jaw tightened. I said something a father should never say to his child, about how she wasn't there enough at the end, which wasn't fair because she was working 2 jobs and driving down every weekend she could. And I knew that I knew it, and I said it anyway because I was angry at the cancer, and she was the only one standing close enough to hit. The radiator clanked. She got in her car and drove back to Akron that night, Leonard said. And I let her go. That's the part I can't. I let her go without saying I was sorry. 3 years now. Every Sunday I think today I'll call. And every Sunday I find a reason not to. Because what do you say after 3 years? How do you even start? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You start, he said by picking up the phone. Leonard gave a thin smile. Says the man who can't even tell me who's coming for his motorcycle. He'd meant it as a joke. But Marcus's face did that flicker again, and this time Leonard caught it, and for just a second the old man's instincts, 30 years of reading people in hallways and lobbies, pricked up. Marcus, he said slowly, is there something you're not telling me? Eat your dinner, Leonard, Marcus said and grinned, and the moment passed. But Leonard didn't forget it. He carried it with him up the stairs that night, turning it over that little flicker, that careful word people. He told himself it was nothing. A man like Marcus had reasons to be careful that an old janitor would never understand. He had no idea. 200 miles away, in a clubhouse outside Detroit, Reese had already made 11 phone calls. By the second call, the word was spreading the way it only spread when something sacred had happened, when one of their own had gone down and a stranger had done the thing the whole world had stopped doing. The story moved from chapter to chapter, state to state, the details sharpening each time someone retold it. An old man, a janitor, walked into a storm, knew the colors and helped anyway. Asked nothing, and every man who heard it heard the same thing underneath the way nobody helped Danny Kane. By the third night, the thing had taken on a momentum that not even Reese fully controlled anymore. How many? Reese asked Tank, who was working the phones beside him. You don't want to know. How many, Tank? Tank set the phone down and looked at him, and there was something like awe on the big man's face. Ohio chapters are all in. Michigan's riding down. Pennsylvania heard about it, and they're coming. Indiana, too. Brother, I stopped counting at 400. He shook his head. It's going to be more than that. A lot more. Everybody wants to be there. Everybody who ever had a Danny. Reese sighed back. He thought about a man he'd never met, an old janitor in a gray uniform who'd gotten down on a bad knee in the rain. Sunday morning, he said, dawn, quiet. We don't tear up his town. We don't scare his neighbors more than we have to. We ride in, we say thank you, and we show that old man what it looks like when family comes for one of theirs. He paused. And nobody tips Marcus off either. I wanted to hit him the same as it hits the old man. Tank grinned. It's gonna be something to see. It's gonna be something to see, Reese agreed quietly. Back in the basement, Leonard's instincts kept nagging at him through the third day. Marcus had grown stronger, sitting up easily now, color back in his face, the fever long gone. By any measure, the man should have left. His club knew where he was. His bike could be fixed. There was no reason for him to still be sleeping on a janitor's cot in a basement. And yet, you're better, Leonard said on Saturday evening, settling into the chair with 2 coffees. Walking fine, eating like a horse. You could have gone home a day ago. I could have. So why are you still here? Marcus took the coffee. He turned the mug in his big hands, and for a long moment, he didn't answer. You ever do something so small, he said finally, that you didn't even think twice about it, and it turned out to be the biggest thing in somebody else's whole life? Leonard frowned. Can't say that I have. No, Marcus said, and there was something almost tender in the way he said it. No, I don't suppose you'd know. That's kind of the point of you, old man. He took a drink. I'm staying because I want to be here in the morning, that's all. There's something I want to see, and I want to see it with you. What's happening in the morning? Sunday, Marcus said. Sunday's happening in the morning. Leonard rolled his eyes. You're a strange man, Marcus Kane. You have no idea, Marcus smiled into his coffee. Hey, do me a favor. In the morning before you start your rounds, go out the front, onto the steps. Take your broom if you want, but go out front first. Promise me. Why, just promise me. Something in the man's voice, quiet, almost reverent, made the hair stand up on Leonard's arms. He didn't know why. He'd lived 74 years on instinct, and right now every instinct he had was telling him that something enormous was sitting just on the other side of the dark, waiting for the sun. All right, Leonard said slowly. I promise. Front steps, before rounds. Good, Marcus said, and let out a long breath like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying for 3 days. Good. That night, where Leonard didn't sleep much, he lay on the spare bedroll he'd made on the floor, having given his cot to Marcus 3 nights running now, and he listened to the big man's steady breathing, and he thought about that flicker, that strange request. Go out front, take your broom, promise me. He thought about his wife gone 4 years. He thought about Emily 2 hours south, 3 years silent. He thought about all the mornings he'd swept that street and all the tenants who'd passed him without seeing him, the way the whole world had agreed somewhere along the line that Leonard Hayes simply wasn't worth noticing. And somewhere past 4 in the morning, he made himself a promise of his own. Tomorrow, he thought, Sunday or no Sunday, whatever, Marcus is on about tomorrow, I call Emily. Marcus is right. You start by picking up the phone. I've let 3 Sundays times 50 go by. Not one more. He didn't know that the morning was going to make the phone call for him. I didn't know that by noon the story of what was about to happen on his street would be on a dozen phones, then 100, then thousands, and that one of those phones scrolling at a kitchen table in Akron would belong to a woman named Emily Hayes, who would see her father's face in a video and not be able to breathe. In the dark hours before dawn, the first engines were already rolling. They came in from the north, down through the wet, pre-dawn dark headlights, strung out along the interstate like a river of fallen stars. They came from Toledo and Youngstown and Columbus, from Detroit and Pittsburgh and Fort Wayne. They rode in loose formation, hundreds of them, and at every on-ramp, the river grew 2 more here, a dozen. They're a whole chapter merging in from a county road. They didn't gun their engines, they didn't whoop or holler. There was a kind of solemnity to it, the way men ride when they're riding for something that matters more than themselves. Truckers pulled over to let them pass. A state trooper near Lorraine clocked the size of the column, radioed it in, listened to the answer, and decided his best move was to simply roll ahead and start clearing intersections. By 5:30, the leading edge of that river was 4 blocks from Ashbury Towers, idling, waiting, holding the formation back. Reese sat at the front of it, helmet under his arm, watching the eastern sky go from black to charcoal to the faintest bruise of gray. Hold here, he said quietly into his radio, and the word passed back down the line, chapter to chapter, 800 men coming to a low rumbling stillness in the dark. We go in at first light, nice and easy. We let the old man come to us. In the basement, Marcus Kane lay awake on the cot, eyes open, listening to a sound that was just barely there. A low, deep, distant thunder that wasn't thunder. A vibration he felt in his chest before he heard it in his ears. He knew that sound. He'd know it anywhere. It was the sound of his family, and it was getting closer. He turned his head. Across the room, Leonard was stirring on the bedroll, rubbing his face, surfacing into another working morning, with no idea at all what was waiting for him 3 floors up. Morning, old man, Marcus said softly, and his voice was thick with something Leonard couldn't place. You remember your promise. Leonard sat up, joints popping. Front steps, he muttered. Before rounds, yeah, I remember. He reached for his uniform shirt. You gonna tell me what this is all about? In about 10 minutes, Marcus said. You're gonna find out for yourself. He sat up on the cot and looked at the old man who'd saved his life, and his eyes were wet again, and this time he didn't bother pretending it was a fever. Leonard, whatever happens out there, I need you to know something first. I need to say it before you go up those stairs. Leonard paused, one arm in his sleeve. Marcus, you walked into a storm for a man the whole world told you to be afraid of, Marcus said, and you asked for nothing. So this morning, his voice caught, this morning something's going to ask you back, and I just need you to do one thing for me, old man. When it happens, when you see it, see what? Marcus stood slow and steady, no trace left of the dying man from the alley. He crossed the small room and put one enormous hand on Leonard's thin shoulder, the way you'd touch family. Don't be afraid, he said. Not this time. This time it's all for you. Outside, 3 floors up and 4 blocks out, The first sliver of sun broke the horizon and 800 engines turned over at once. The sound hit Leonard before he understood it. I was halfway up the basement stairs, broom in hand, grumbling under his breath about Marcus and his riddles when the whole building began to tremble. Not shake, tremble, the way the windows used to rattle when the freight trains came through, except this didn't pass. It built. It rolled in from somewhere outside and got louder and deeper, until he could feel it in his teeth, in the rail under his hand, in the floor under his feet. "What in God's name?" he muttered and quickened his step, his bad knee forgotten. He pushed through the lobby door. Mrs. Petrakis was already there in her robe, and so was old Mr. Donnelly from 4A and the young couple from the second floor with their baby, all of them crowded at the front glass with their faces pressed close, and not one of them turned to look at Leonard when he came up behind them. "What's everybody?" he started. Then he saw their faces. He'd never seen Mrs. Petrakis look like that. Mouth open, hand over her chest, and the young mother had her baby clutched tight and tears already standing in her eyes, and she was whispering, oh my God, look at them all." Leonard stepped past them to the door. His hand found the handle, and he remembered his promise, go out to the front, take your broom, promised me, and even though every nerve in his old body was screaming at the sheer wall of sound on the other side of that glass, he pushed the door open and stepped out onto the front steps of Ashbury Towers. And the world stopped. For one long heartbeat, Leonard Hayes simply could not make sense of what his eyes were showing him. The street was gone. The street he had swept 10,000 times, the cracked sidewalk, the dented mailbox, the spot by the curb where the city never fixed the pothole. All of it was gone, swallowed whole. In its place was an ocean of chrome and black leather and steel. And steel was stretching down, woodward as far as he could see in both directions around the corner. Out of sight, a mass of motorcycles and men so vast that his mind refused at first to count it as real. Hundreds, no more than hundreds. They lined both sides of the avenue, 3 and 4 deep, packed shoulder to shoulder, handlebar to handlebar, and every engine was turning over at once, a single enormous heartbeat that he felt in the soles of his feet. The broom slipped out of Leonard's hand and clattered down the steps. He didn't even notice. 800 faces had turned toward him. 800 men in colors he'd been taught his whole life to fear, and every last one of them was looking at a 74-year-old janitor in a faded gray uniform, standing frozen at the top of his steps. And then all at once, as if some signal had passed through them, the engines died. The silence that crashed down was almost worse than the noise. It was total. A whole city block packed with the most feared men in America, and you could have heard a coin drop on the pavement. Leonard's heart slammed against his ribs. His hands had gone numb. Some old animal part of his brain was telling him to turn, go back through the door, lock it. This was a mistake. This was danger. Men like this didn't gather like this for any good reason. A voice behind him, low and steady, said, "Easy, old man. I told you. Don't be afraid." Not this time. Leonard turned. Marcus had come up the stairs behind him, dressed now. Not in borrowed coveralls, but in clean black leather, his own colors back across his shoulders, standing tall and whole and strong, no trace left of the dying man from the alley. And his face, God, his face was wet and proud and breaking open all at once. "Marcus," Leonard whispered, "what is this? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Marcus said softly. "You did. 3 nights ago. You just didn't know what it added up to." He put a hand on Leonard's shoulder and gently turned him back to face the street. "These are my brothers, Leonard. They rode all night, from Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana. Some of them rode 300 miles in the dark to get here before the sun came up." His voice cracked. "And they didn't come for me." From the front of that endless sea of riders, one man swung off his bike. Big, gray-bearded, a face like carved oak. He walked toward the steps with his helmet under his arm, and the crowd parted for him, and he stopped at the bottom and looked up at Leonard with eyes that were not hard at all. "Mr. Hayes," he said, and his voice carried in the silence. "My name's Reese. I'm the one Marcus called. I've been riding with this club 31 years. He paused, and the big man's jaw worked. "In all that time, I never once seen the whole family come together like this for anything. Not a funeral, not a wedding, nothing." He looked down the impossible length of the column, then back up at Leonard. "Then I got a phone call 3 nights ago about an old man who walked into a storm." Leonard couldn't speak. His mouth had gone dry as paper. "You want to know why we're all here?" Reese went on, and his voice dropped rough now. 11 years ago, this man's little brother went down on a wet road. Danny, 26 years old. A muscle jumped in Reese's cheek. 40 cars drove past him while he was dying. 40 people looked at a man down in the rain and decided he wasn't their problem. We buried Danny Kane in the spring, and not one of us ever stopped carrying it. He looked at Marcus, and something passed between the two men that had 11 years of grief inside it. We've been waiting 11 years to meet the kind of person who wouldn't drive past, and we'd about given up believing he still existed. Reese turned back to Leonard, and now the old man could see that the carved oak face was wet too. Then you walked into that alley, Reese said, on a bad knee, in a storm, for a man you'd been told your whole life to be scared of, and you asked him for nothing. His voice broke clean in half. Mister, you have no idea what you gave back to 800 men who'd stopped believing that kind of thing was real. A sound went through the crowd, then not a cheer, nothing so loud as that. A murmur, a low rumble of agreement, of grief, of something that had been waiting 11 years to be set down. Men nodded, men looked away and wiped their faces with the backs of their hands. A few of them hard men with scarred knuckles and faces like fists were openly weeping in the gray morning light, and not one of them seemed ashamed of it. Leonard's legs nearly gave out. He reached for the railing and gripped it. His voice came out cracked and small. He had to start again. I just made him some soup. I gave him a blanket. Anybody would have. No, said a voice from the crowd. A younger rider, maybe 30, pushing forward. No, sir. Anybody wouldn't have. That's the whole point. 40 people didn't. His chin trembled. My brother went down 2 years ago outside Flint. Same thing. Nobody stopped. He couldn't go on. He just shook his head and stepped back into the crowd. And then another voice further back, same here. And another, my old man, Highway 23. Nobody stopped. And another voices rising up out of that ocean of leather, each one carrying its own ghost, its own person left to die in the rain, while the world drove past. Leonard stood at the top of his steps and understood slowly with a horror and a grief that swelled up in his chest until he could hardly breathe, that he wasn't looking at 800 dangerous strangers at all. I was looking at 800 grieving brothers, 800 men who had each at some point lost someone the way Danny Kane was lost alone, ignored, passed by. And they had ridden through the night, all of them, to stand in front of the one man who had broken the curse, the one man who had stopped. The tears came then finally, and Leonard didn't try to stop them. They ran down the deep lines of his face and dropped off his chin onto the steps he'd swept 10,000 times. I didn't know, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't for any of you. I didn't know. That's why it counts, Marcus said quietly beside him. You didn't do it for any of this. You didn't do it for a reward or a thank you or a single thing. You did it because a man needed help and you were there. He turned Leonard gently by the shoulders, so the old man was facing him. Do you remember what you said to me in the alley when I asked you why? Leonard nodded, unable to speak. Say it again, Marcus said. Say it so they can all hear it. Leonard looked out at the sea of faces. His voice shook, but it carried. Because you needed help, he said, and I was there. For a moment, nothing happened. And then Reese put his helmet on the ground, and he raised his fist into the air, and he began to clap, slow, hard, deliberate. And the man beside him joined, and the men beside him, and it spread down the column like fire down a fuse until all 800 of them were on their feet, fists raised, roaring the sound, rolling up Woodward Street, and breaking against the front of Ashbury Towers like a wave hitting a cliff. Windows flew open up and down the block. People leaned out in their pajamas, phones up, recording, weeping, calling to each other. A whole neighborhood that had spent 30 years not seeing Leonard Hayes was suddenly seeing nothing else. And in the middle of it all stood an old janitor with his broom on the steps below him, undone and made weeping in front of the whole world, finally seen. Marcus let it roll for a while. He stood beside Leonard with one hand still on the old man's shoulder, steadying him, and when the roar finally began to ebb, he raised his own hand and the crowd quieted. There's one more thing, Marcus said, and now he was looking only at Leonard. When I was lying on your cot the first night, burning up half out of my head, you talked to me all night. You probably figured I didn't hear most of it. He smiled, wet-eyed. I heard it. I heard about your wife, and I heard about your daughter. Leonard went very still. Emily, Marcus said gently. Crone, 3 years. Marcus. Leonard's voice was a whisper of warning, of fear. Marcus, what did you... I didn't call her, Marcus said. I want you to hear that. I didn't call her, and I didn't tell anybody to. That wasn't mine to do. He paused. But brother, you gotta understand something. 800 bikes rolling into downtown Cleveland at sunrise on a Sunday. Half the people on this block are filming it right now. By noon, it's gonna be on every phone in Ohio. He squeezed Leonard's shoulder. And the story that goes with it is gonna have your name on it. Leonard Hayes, the janitor who walked into a storm. Leonard's hand flew to his mouth. She's gonna see it, Marcus said softly. Whether either of us wanted that or not, she's gonna see your face, and then it's gonna be up to the two of you what happens next. His eyes searched Leonard's. You told me you'd let 3 years of Sundays go by because you didn't know how to start. Well, he gestured at the impossible sea of riders behind him, at the open windows, at the phones, at the whole world that had just turned to look. Seems to me the start just got made for you. Question is whether you pick up when she calls. Leonard stared at him. Somewhere down the block, a woman in a fourth-floor window was crying into her phone, narrating it to someone on the other end. Somewhere south of here, in a small apartment in Akron, the morning was just an ordinary morning. Coffee brewing, a woman not yet knowing that her father's face was about to come across her screen and split her chest wide open. I don't, Leonard's voice failed. He tried again. What if she doesn't call? What if she sees it and she's still angry? 3 years, Marcus. The things I said. Then you call her, Marcus said. You hear me? If she doesn't call by tonight, you pick up the phone and you call her and you say the thing you've been too scared to say for 3 years. You don't let one more Sunday go by. His jaw tightened. I'd give anything for one more phone call with Danny, one. And you've still got yours sitting there 2 hours down the road alive. Don't you dare waste it, old man, not after what you taught me. And right there on the front steps in front of 800 of the most feared men in America and a whole neighborhood hanging out its windows. Leonard Hayes broke down completely and put his arms around a Hells Angels road captain, and Marcus held the old man up while he shook the way Leonard had held him up in the alley 3 nights before. Down the block near the front of the column, one of the older riders, a man with a long white beard and a patch that marked him as a chapter president, climbed slowly off his bike and made his way to the steps. He carried something in his hands wrapped in cloth. Mr. Hayes, he said, and the crowd hushed again. I'm Walt. I rode down from Erie. I want to give you something if you'll take it. He unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small, worn patch, the kind a man wears for years, the edges soft and frayed. This belonged to a brother of mine. Gone now 3 winters back. Heart attack alone in his garage 2 days before anybody found him. Walt's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. I've been carrying his patch ever since. Didn't know what to do with it. Didn't feel right to bury it, and didn't feel right to keep it. He held it out. I want you to have it, because you're the kind of man who would have gone looking for him and the kind who'd have found him in time. And I think he'd want it with somebody like that. Leonard looked down at the frayed little patch in the old rider's scarred hands, and he understood that he was being given something that could not be measured in money or in words. Something that had a dead man's whole life folded into it, and he took it with both hands like it was made of glass. I'll keep it safe, he said, barely able to get the words out. I promise you, I'll keep it safe. Walt nodded once hard, his jaw clenched against the thing rising in his throat, and stepped back into the crowd. And then they started coming, one by one, then 2 by 2 riders breaking from the formation and climbing the steps to shake the old man's hand. Some just gripped his hand and looked him in the eye and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. Some pressed things into his palms, folded bills, a pocket knife, a St. Christopher medal worn smooth, small treasures from the road. Some wrapped him in hugs that lifted him half off his feet. A line formed 800 deep, snaking down Woodward Street. 800 men waiting their turn to touch the hand of the janitor, who'd done the thing none of them had been there to do for the people they'd loved and lost. It would take hours. Leonard shook every single hand, and up in the lobby behind the glass, Mrs. Petrakis stood with her hand still pressed to her chest, watching the man she'd scolded just yesterday for working too hard, the man she'd known for 15 years and never once truly looked at, and she wept and she whispered to no one at all. I never knew, all this time, I never knew who he was. None of them had. But 2 hours south, a phone was about to ring at a kitchen table in Akron, and a woman named Emily Hayes was about to look down at a video a coworker had just sent her with the words, "Isn't this your dad?" And she was about to see for the first time in 3 years her father's face wet with tears, surrounded by 800 strangers who'd ridden through the night to tell him he mattered. And her hands were going to start shaking so hard she'd nearly dropped the phone. The phone buzzed against the kitchen table in Akron, and Emily Hayes almost didn't pick it up. It was Sunday morning. She had a mug of coffee going cold and a list of nothing in particular to do, and the text was from Carla at work, who forwarded her every animal video and every chain message that crossed the internet. Emily glanced at it sideways. Then she saw the words, "Isn't this your dad?" Her hand stopped halfway to the mug. She picked up the phone. She pressed play. And for the first 3 seconds, she didn't understand what she was looking at. A shaky vertical video. Somebody filming out an apartment window, a street so packed with motorcycles that she thought at first it had to be a parade or a movie set or something fake. The sound was deafening even through the tiny speaker. Hundreds of bikes, 1,000. And then the camera zoomed in jerky and unsteady toward a set of front steps and toward an old man standing at the top of them. Emily stopped breathing. It was her father. It was her father in his gray janitor's uniform, the one he'd worn her whole childhood, the one she used to be embarrassed by in middle school and would have given anything to see again now. He was standing on those steps with his hand over his mouth and his shoulders were shaking, and even through the awful, grainy video, she could see that he was crying her father, who she had seen cry exactly twice in her entire life, once at her wedding and once at her mother's funeral. And around him, below him, stretching off the edge of the frame, in every direction were hundreds of leather-clad bikers, and they were cheering for him, fists in the air, a roar that crackled the phone's tiny speaker, and a man beside him in black leather had a hand on his shoulder holding him up. The phone slipped in Emily's fingers. She caught it. Her hands had started to shake so hard she had to set it down flat on the table to keep watching. The caption under the video had her father's name in it, Leonard Hayes, Cleveland janitor, took in a sick biker during the storm. This morning, 800 Hells Angels showed up to thank him. "Oh my God," Emily whispered to her empty kitchen. "Oh my God, Dad." She watched it again and again. By the fourth time she was sobbing, one hand pressed flat against her mouth, the other gripping the edge of the table, because 3 years of silence had just collapsed into a single 30-second video, and she could see in her father's broken open face everything she had spent 3 years telling herself she didn't need to see. He looked older. He looked smaller. He looked standing there in front of all those strangers exactly as alone as she'd been afraid he was, and exactly as good as she'd always known underneath everything that he was. She thought about the funeral, about the words he'd thrown at her, "You weren't there enough" at the end, and the words she'd thrown back, worse ones, words about him never being there for her or for Mom. Her whole life, words she'd known were cruel even as they left her mouth. She thought about driving back to Akron that night, shaking with anger, swearing she'd never call him again. She thought about how that vow had hardened week by week into 3 years until calling had become this enormous, impossible thing, a door so heavy she couldn't even look at it. And now here he was on her phone screen, weeping on a set of steps, while 800 strangers told him he mattered. 800 strangers, she thought, and the shame of it went through her like ice water. 800 strangers rode through the night to tell my father he mattered, and his own daughter hasn't called him in 3 years. She picked up the phone. Her thumb hovered over his name in her contacts, Dad, right there where it had sat untouched for 3 years. Her heart was slamming. What would she even say? After everything. After 3 years. "Hi, Dad, I saw you on the internet." She'd hung up on him in her head 100 times over those 3 years, rehearsing all the things she'd say if he ever called her, all the ways she'd make him understand how much he'd hurt her. None of those words seemed to exist anymore. She pressed his name. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Emily pressed her free hand against her chest like she could hold her own heart in. "Pick up, Dad. Please pick up, please." But 200 miles north on the steps of Ashbury Towers, Leonard couldn't hear his phone. It was buried in the pocket of his uniform, drowned completely under the roar of a street full of engines and 800 men still moving slowly past him to shake his hand. The line rang and rang in his pocket unheard, and finally went to the voicemail he'd recorded years ago, in his flat, tired voice. "You've reached Leonard, leave a message," and Emily, 200 miles away, heard her father's voice for the first time in 3 years and completely fell apart. She couldn't even leave a message. She tried. She opened her mouth and nothing came out but a sob, and she hung up, mortified, shaking, and immediately hated herself for hanging up. She called again. Voicemail again. A third time. Voicemail. "He's not answering," she said aloud, panic rising. And then she laughed through her tears, half hysterical, because Of course he wasn't answering. He was standing in the middle of 800 motorcycles. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. She made herself breathe. And then with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, she did the thing she should have done 3 years ago and had been too proud and too scared to do. She got her keys. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't change out of the sweatshirt she'd slept in. She grabbed her keys and her phone and her coat off the hook, and she was out the door of her apartment before she'd even fully decided to go, taking the stairs two at a time. And she was in her car and pulling out of the lot before the rational part of her brain could catch up and tell her all the reasons this was crazy. 2 hours. It's 2 hours. He might not even want to see me. I might get there and he'll look at me the way he looked at me at the funeral. She got on the highway heading north anyway. 80 miles an hour with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel and tears blurring the road in front of her. While back in Cleveland, the line of riders kept moving past her father one by one, hour after hour. And Leonard, who had no idea his daughter was at that very moment flying up I-77 toward him at 80 miles an hour, kept shaking hands. He shook the hand of a man named Diego, who'd ridden up from Columbus with his teenage son riding behind him, and the man told him, "I wanted my boy to see this. I wanted him to see what one good person looks like, so he knows it's still possible." And the kid, 16 awkward, looked at Leonard with something close to awe and said, "Thank you, sir." And Leonard had to grip the railing again. He shook the hand of a woman. There were women too. He realized riders in their own right who held his hand in both of hers and said nothing. Just looked at him with eyes full of some old grief and squeezed and moved on. He shook the hand of the man who told him, voice breaking, that he'd been about to leave the club, about to walk away from all of it, because he'd lost faith that any of it meant anything anymore, and that the phone call about an old janitor in a storm had been the thing that made him stay. "You don't know what you did," the man said. It was the third time someone had said those exact words to Leonard that morning. "You don't know what you did." I was starting to understand that he never fully would. Around mid-morning, Reese came back up the steps and stood beside him and gestured for a few of the men to bring something forward. They came carrying boxes, bags, armloads of things. "We didn't come empty-handed," Reese said. "Word went out that you'd been living in that basement, so everybody brought something." And they laid it out on the steps and the sidewalk, food, so much food, casseroles and boxes of canned goods and bags of fresh groceries, enough to fill the little basement room twice over. Winter supplies, a brand new heavy coat still with the tags in exactly Leonard's size because somebody had thought to ask Marcus. Thick wool socks, gloves, a new space heater still boxed. Gift cards, a thick stack of them, rubber banded together. And an envelope. Reese handed it to Leonard last, and it was heavy, and when Leonard opened it, his knees nearly went out from under him for the third time that morning. "We passed the hat," Reese said simply. 800 guys. Some gave $5. Some gave a lot more. It's enough to fix up that room you've been living in. Make it a real home, or do whatever you want with it. It's yours now." He paused, watching Leonard's face. "You spent 30 years taking care of a building full of people who never even learned your name. Let somebody take care of you for once." Leonard looked down at the envelope, at the food, at the coat, at the 800 faces, and he opened his mouth to say he couldn't accept this. It was too much. He'd only done what anyone, and Reese stopped him with a raised hand before he could even start. "Don't," Reese said gently. "Don't you dare. You take it. Because if you give it back, you take away the only thing every one of these men came here to do. We all got people we couldn't help in time. Let us help the one we still can." His voice roughened. "Please, let us." And Leonard, who had spent his whole life giving and almost never receiving, closed his mouth and nodded, and the tears came again, and he said, "Thank you. Thank you. I don't thank you." It was all he had. It was a little after 11 when Marcus's phone rang, and he stepped aside to take it, and when he came back, his face had changed. "Leonard," he said quietly, pulling the old man a little away from the crowd, "I got to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm." Leonard's stomach dropped. "What is it?" "One of my guys was working crowd control down at the corner, keeping the street clear, keeping people back." Marcus's jaw worked. "A car just pulled up, woman driving. She's trying to get through, says she has to get to this address, and he paused. "She's pretty hysterical, brother, crying so hard she can barely talk. My guy asked her name so he could figure out if she was a resident." Leonard's heart had begun to pound. Marcus. She said her name's Emily Hayes, Marcus said softly. She said she's looking for her father. The street, the noise, the 800 men, the food, the envelope, all of it fell away. Leonard stood frozen on the steps and the whole world narrowed down to 4 words. She's looking for her father. She's here, he whispered. He didn't dare believe it. She drove up. She's here. She's at the corner, Marcus said. Couple 100 feet down. My guys are holding the line. They didn't know who she was. They were just keeping the street clear. His eyes searched Leonard's. You want me to bring her through? For a moment, Leonard couldn't answer. 3 years. 3 years of Sundays. The words at the funeral. The door so heavy he couldn't look at it. And now she was 200 feet away, having driven 2 hours on a Sunday morning without being asked because she'd seen his face on a screen and gotten in her car. She came, Leonard breathed. She came on her own. Marcus, I didn't even get to call her. She came on her own. Yeah, old man, Marcus said, and his voice was thick. She came on her own. So what do you want to do? And then Leonard did something that surprised even himself. He didn't say bring her through. He pushed himself off the railing and on his bad knee with his heart hammering and his old legs barely steady under him. He started down the steps into the crowd toward the corner where his daughter was waiting. The men saw what was happening. Marcus must have signaled, or maybe they just understood, and the sea of leather parted in front of him. 800 of the most feared men in America stepped back and made a path, a clear channel right down the middle of the packed street all the way to the corner. And Leonard Hayes walked down it as fast as his old legs would carry him, and the men he passed went quiet and watched him go. Because they all knew, every one of them knew what it was to want one more chance with somebody you'd lost. At the corner, Emily had abandoned her car, half in the intersection, and was standing pressed against the line of bikers on her toes, frantic, scanning the impossible crowd for any sign of him, sobbing and saying, please, please, my dad, I just need to see my dad. To a wall of leather that had no idea she was about to become the most important person on that street. And then the wall parted, and she saw him, Dad. The sound that came out of her was not a word so much as 3 years breaking open all at once. Leonard heard it, and his whole face crumpled. And he stopped trying to be steady, stopped trying to be anything, and just opened his arms. Emily ran. She shoved through the last gap in the crowd, and she ran the final 20 feet, and she hit her father so hard, she nearly knocked the old man off his feet, and Leonard caught her and held on. And they stood there in the middle of Woodward Street, surrounded by 800 bikers, and they both came completely apart. I'm sorry, Emily was saying into his shoulder over and over, the words tumbling out between sobs. Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. 3 years. I'm so sorry. I should have called. I should have called 1,000 times. I'm sorry. No, Leonard said, holding her face in his old hands, his own face streaming. No, baby, no. It was me. What I said at the funeral to you, I had no right. You were there. You were always there. I was angry and I was hurting and I took it out on the one person who didn't deserve it. And I have wanted to call you every single Sunday for 3 years, and I was too much of a coward to do it. His voice shattered. I'm the one who's sorry. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry. I saw you on the video, she wept. I saw your face and I couldn't. I got in the car, Dad. I didn't even think I just got in the car. You came, Leonard whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. You came. And all around them, the men who had ridden through the night for one old man's kindness now stood witness to what that kindness had set loose. A father and a daughter finding their way back across 3 years of silence, right there in the middle of the street. And these hard men, these scarred and feared men, every one of them carrying his own ghost, his own person, he could never get back, watched a reunion that none of them would ever get to have, and they wept openly without shame. And a few of them put their hands over their hearts, and slowly, quietly, they began to clap again. But soft this time, gentle, almost tender, a sound like rain. Marcus stood at the edge of it with his arms crossed and his face wet, and a feeling in his chest he hadn't felt since before Danny died. The feeling of something being made right in a world that almost never let things be made right. You did this, he said quietly to no one, to Danny, to the cold November sky. You hear me, little brother? An old man with a broom did this. There's still good ones out there. There's still good ones. When Emily finally pulled back enough to look at her father's face, she wiped her eyes and gave a wet, disbelieving laugh and looked around at the impossible scene. The 800 bikes, the men, the whole shut down street. Dad, she said, what is all this? Who are these people? What did you do? And Leonard Hayes, 74 years old janitor of Ashbury Towers, for 30 years the man everyone had passed without seeing for 3 decades, looked around at the army that had come for him, and then back at the daughter he'd just gotten back, and he answered her the only way he knew how, the same way he'd answered Marcus in the alley, the same way he'd answer for the rest of his life. A man needed help, he said simply, and I was there. That's all, baby. That's all it ever was. But Emily was already shaking her head, looking from the bikers to her father and back again, because she could see in their faces, in the way 800 dangerous men were looking at her gentle, ordinary father, that it had never been only that. That it had been something much larger. That her father had done something that morning and 3 nights before that she was only beginning to understand. And she didn't yet know the half of it, didn't know about the alley, the storm, the fever, the cop, the all-night vigil. She didn't know about Danny Kane and the 40 cars. She didn't know that the big man in black leather, watching them with tears running into his beard, was the reason all of this existed, and that he was at this very moment walking slowly toward them through the parted crowd with something he needed to say to both of them. Marcus reached them as Emily was still wiping her eyes, and he stopped a respectful few feet away, and he waited until Leonard looked up and saw him. Marcus, Leonard said, come here, Emily baby. This is Marcus. This is the man. His voice wavered. This is the man from the storm. Emily turned to look at the enormous biker, and Marcus saw her take in the leather, the patches the size of him, and he saw the flicker of instinctive fear cross her face, the same fear Leonard had refused to feel in the alley. And then Marcus did something that none of his brothers had ever seen him do. He got down. This huge man, this road captain, lowered himself onto one knee on the coal pavement so that he wasn't towering over the daughter of the man who'd saved his life, so that he could look her in the eye on the level. Miss Hayes, he said, and his voice cracked on her name, I need you to know something about your father. He had to stop and gather himself. 3 nights ago, I was dying. That's not me being dramatic. I was lying in an alley behind that building with a fever cooking my brain, and I'd already decided that was where it ended for me. I'd made my peace with dying alone in the rain. He looked up at Leonard, then back at her. 40 people drove past my little brother while he died the exact same way 11 years ago. So I figured that's just how the world is. People walk past. That's the rule. Emily's hand had risen to her mouth. And then your father came out, Marcus said. 74 years old, bad knee, skinny as a fence post. He got down on the ground next to me in a storm, and he looked at these patches that have made grown men cross the street their whole lives, and he didn't even blink. He dragged me down a flight of stairs on his own back. He gave me his bed. He gave me his blankets, his wife's blanket, the one she made. He sat up all night with a wet rag and wouldn't let me quit. And when I asked him why a man would do that for somebody like me, you know what he said? Because you needed help, Emily whispered, and he was there. Marcus's face broke. He already told you. No, Emily said, tears spilling over again. No, he didn't. I just know him. That's exactly who he is. That's who he always was. She turned to her father, and the grief in her face was the grief of 3 years suddenly seen clearly. That's who I walked away from. For 3 years. Hey, Leonard said softly, pulling her back into his arms. Hey now, you walked back. That's the part that counts. You walked back. Marcus rose slowly to his feet. He put one massive hand on Leonard's shoulder and the other gently on Emily's, and he looked at the two of them standing there in the middle of the street that his brothers had shut down. Your father gave me back something I lost the day Danny died, he said quietly. He gave me back the idea that there's still good people, real ones, the kind who stop. His jaw tightened. I rode with this club for 20 years thinking that good was a thing that used to exist and didn't anymore. One night in a basement with your old man fixed that. He squeezed her shoulder. So whatever happened between you two, 3 years, 3 decades, doesn't matter to me. I'm telling you, as a man who would give his own life for one more day with somebody he lost, you got him back. Don't waste a single day of it, not one. Emily nodded, unable to speak, and reached up and put her hand over Marcus's on her shoulder, and the biggest, most feared man on that street, and the daughter of the gentlest man on it, stood there for a moment, connected, two people grieving and grateful all at once. The riders stayed a few hours more. They could have stayed all day, but Reese understood something about dignity, and about not turning a man's life into a circus. And as the morning wore toward noon, he gave a quiet signal, and the word passed back down the column the way it always did. It was time. They'd done what they came to do, but before they left, they did one last thing. Reese climbed the steps one final time and turned to face the whole assembly, 800 strong, and he raised his hand, and the street went silent again. That total breathtaking silence of hundreds of men holding still. "We came here this morning," Reese called out, his voice carrying down the block, "because one man did the thing the rest of the world forgot how to do. He stopped. He helped. He asked for nothing." He looked back at Leonard standing at the top of the steps with his daughter under his arm. From this day on, Leonard Hayes is family to every chapter in 4 states. You understand me? That means if this man ever needs anything, a ride of repair, a roof, a friend at 2 in the morning, there is always somebody who will come. He will never, as long as he lives, be a man that nobody comes for. Not ever again. His voice thundered now. Is that understood? And 800 men roared back a single word that shook the windows of Ashbury Towers, and Leonard Hayes wept into his daughter's hair. And Emily held her father up, the way the bikers had held him up that morning, the way he'd held a dying stranger up 3 nights before. Then one by one, the engines turned over. The great river of chrome and leather came back to life, and the riders began to pull out, peeling off the avenue in long, thundering columns. And as each group passed the steps, they slowed and raised a fist, and the men nodded to the old janitor standing at the top. And Leonard raised his hand back to every single one of them until his arm ached. Marcus was the last to go. He climbed the steps one final time, his own bike towed in from where it had died 3 blocks over, and patched up overnight by brothers who knew engines was idling at the curb below. He took Leonard's hand in both of his. "I don't know how to thank you, old man," he said. "There aren't words big enough." "You already did," Leonard said. "You brought my daughter back to me. You didn't even mean to. You just made enough noise that she finally saw my face." He smiled through his tears. "I'd been trying to call her for 3 years and couldn't manage one phone call. You managed 800 motorcycles. Seems about right for you." Marcus laughed, wet and rough. Then he reached into his vest and pulled something out, a small patch, his own worn soft at the edges. He pressed it into Leonard's palm and closed the old man's fingers around it. "This one's mine," he said, "not a dead man's. Mine. So you always know you got a brother on the road." His voice dropped. "Danny would have loved you, old man. He really would have." "Then I'll keep him in mind," Leonard said. "Every time I look at it." Marcus pulled him into one last embrace. "Careful the way you hold something precious," and then he let go and went down the steps and swung onto his bike. And he looked back up at Leonard and Emily one more time. "Be good to each other," he called. "You hear me? Life's short. I learned that the hard way. Don't you two learn it the hard way too?" "We won't," Emily called back, and she meant it with everything in her. Marcus nodded once hard and dropped his bike into gear and rode off down the empty avenue after his brothers. The last echo of 800 engines fading slowly into the gray Cleveland morning, until at last the street was quiet again. Quiet the way it had always been, but nothing else was the same. Emily didn't go back to Akron that day. She stayed. She helped her father carry box after box of food down into the little basement room. And when she saw where he'd been living, the folding cot, the humming radiator, the peeling paint, the single bare bulb, she sat down on the cot and cried again. Not from sorrow this time, but from a kind of fierce, overwhelming love. And she said, "You're not staying down here anymore, Dad. Not like this, not after today." And Leonard, who would have argued about it a week ago, who had spent 30 years insisting he didn't need anything from anybody, looked at the envelope full of 800 men's generosity and looked at his daughter and simply said, "Okay, baby, okay." They used the money the way Reese had told him to. They fixed up the room, first real, heat-fresh paint, a proper bed. But more than that, Emily started coming up from Akron every weekend, and then she started talking about whether her father might come stay with her, might finally retire, might finally let somebody take care of him. And slowly over that winter, the conversation that had been frozen for 3 years began to thaw and move and become a real thing again. A father and a daughter rebuilding something they'd both thought was lost for good. The story spread the way stories do now. The shaky video from the apartment window was seen by millions before the week was out. People wrote about it. Strangers from all over the country sent letters to Ashbury Towers addressed simply to Leonard the Janitor, Cleveland. And the post office somehow got every one of them to him. People he'd never met told him he'd made them believe in something again. A man in Oregon wrote that he'd stopped to help a stranger on the highway because of Leonard's story, and that the stranger had turned out to be having a heart attack, and that Leonard had, in a way, saved a life 2,000 miles away without ever leaving Cleveland. The tenants of Ashbury Towers never looked at him the same way again. Mrs. Petrakis started leaving him plates of food outside his door, and learned finally after 15 years to call him by his name. The young couple from the second floor asked him to be a kind of honorary grandfather to their baby. Mr. Donnelly from 4A, who'd never said 2 words to him in a decade, started waiting in the lobby some nights just to talk. The invisible man had become somehow the most beloved person in the building. But here is the truth of it. The thing that mattered most, the thing Leonard understood, is that winter turned slowly towards spring. His life from the outside looked almost exactly the same. He still cleaned the same hallways. He still pushed the same old mop through the same silent building in the small hours of the night. The motorcycles were gone. The letters slowed and then stopped. The world, the way the world does, moved on to the next story. And yet everything was different, because Leonard Hayes carried 2 patches in his breast pocket, now one, a dead man's, and one, a living brother's. And he carried his daughter's voice on the phone every few days, and he carried the knowledge, bone deep, unshakable, earned that one cold night when it would have been so easy to lock the door and walk away. He had chosen the harder thing. He had chosen compassion when fear would have been understood and forgiven. He had walked into the storm. And that single choice had rippled outward, farther than he could ever measure. Had saved a dying man, had healed an 11-year-old wound in 800 grieving hearts, had reopened a door between a father and a daughter that both of them had given up for closed, had reached a stranger in Oregon, and 1,000 more he'd never know about. One spring evening, near the end of his shift, Leonard pushed his mop down the quiet second-floor hallway, humming the song his wife used to love. And he thought about Marcus, somewhere out on the road, and he thought about Danny, who he'd never met, and he thought about the 40 cars that hadn't stopped, and he thought, I almost didn't go out that night either. I almost let it go. I almost became the 41st car. But he hadn't. He'd opened the door. And that, Leonard Hayes finally understood, was the whole secret of a life, not the grand gestures, not the 800 motorcycles, not the letters or the cameras, or the fame that came and went like weather. It was the door. It was the small, quiet, unwitnessed moment when a person decides against every reason to do otherwise to treat a frightening stranger like a human being. It was the choice nobody sees made for no reward that ends up echoing through the whole world. Because the most dangerous-looking man Leonard ever met turned out to be a brother in disguise, a grieving little brother, a son, a man who had only ever needed someone to stop. And the loneliest, most invisible old man on Woodward Street turned out to have locked inside him all along the one thing the whole world had forgotten it was starving for: the willingness to stop, the willingness to open the door. So if you take one thing from the night, Leonard Hayes walked into a storm. Let it be this, and let it be simple, and let it be true. The person who looks the most frightening to you may be the one most desperately waiting to be treated like a human being again. And the smallest door you open for a stranger may turn out to be the very door that somewhere down the long road of your life opens right back up for you. Leonard learned that in one Cleveland winter. And he never for the rest of his days let a single door stay closed again.